Tonight we are speaking with Dr. Petar Pavlovic, a physicist. His interest, as far as I know, primarily in cosmology, theoretical cosmology, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, if you can just please tell us a little bit more about your background, your interests, and research doing.
So, okay, I mean, regarding my professional background, I first obtained master's degree in physics at the University of Zagreb in Croatia, and then I started my PhD study, and I obtained my PhD degree in Germany at the University of Hamburg, and that was specialized in theoretical cosmology, so more precisely the physics of the early universe and the electromagnetic fields in the early universe. And after that, after obtaining the PhD, I spent around 2 years in India, in Kolkata, at Swami Vivekananda University as a part of my postdoc research. So my research is mostly focused, as we said a couple of times already, actually on cosmology, so the physical discipline which tries to describe the whole universe, the evolution of the whole universe. And my special emphasis in cosmology is the very, very early universe, the very high energies of the universe. And this is connected with another main topic of my research, and that is general relativity and the description of gravity as a geometry of space-time. And in this respect, I'm especially interested in thinking how we can better understand how to combine quantum physics and general relativity, which we don't know how to do now, but what could be some first effective steps that we could take to reach that goal of unification. So with respect to that, I'm doing a lot of research in the so-called modified gravity theories, which means that you explore what are the possibilities of extending general relativity and modifying it in order to see the possibilities of a new theory of gravity which would combine it with quantum physics. So that is like broadly what is my research interest about. But apart from that, I'm also very much interested in the foundational questions of physics and philosophy of science and philosophy of nature. So actually, what is the meaning of our physical theories? What are the limitations of the mathematical language? How come the mathematical language can, at least to some extent, describe this reality in which we live? And how to actually understand what physical theories, what mathematical language is saying to us. What is the actual meaning of our theories? This is a very complicated question. It's not that easy that you can know that directly.
But as far as I know, you also, as you already pointed out, you have interest in philosophy also.
Yes, in general.
In general,
yes.
Both East and West. But as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but you have particular interest in the philosophy of Kashmiri Shaivism.
Yeah, you are not wrong.
So, okay, so what is about philosophy that, in what way can philosophy nowadays help be useful to physicists in their endeavors?
Okay, so the Kashmir Shaivism should be, I guess, the separate question. So
but
let me just first concentrate
general,
on general. So I think to say briefly that physics, and not only physics, but whole science, it cannot even begin nor end without philosophy. It cannot begin without philosophy because in order to develop a certain science and discipline, you first need some basic notions that you take and work within that discipline. And apart from these notions, like notions of space, time, cause, effect, finite, infinite, law, equation, you have all these notions that you do not develop them in the science itself. You just assume that they are existing and you are using them in order to build a certain a certain theory. So first of all, there is a need to assume and to actually set up all these notions with which you start. And the other thing is that you always take some kind of assumption about the structure of reality. That is actually a basis on which every science is developed. And neither of the separate sciences, natural sciences, is actually dealing with those questions. What is the meaning of those notions? How can we actually motivate a certain set of assumptions and somehow relate them to our experience? This is all actually a matter of philosophy. So that's why I said we cannot start doing science actually without philosophy. And then I said also we cannot, even the science cannot reach its goal, or it cannot end without a philosophy, because when we reach some conclusion, when we construct some theory or do some measurement, then we just obtained in natural sciences like physics a certain mathematical expression, a certain isolated fact which tells about a specific type of relationship between some systems or parts of the system. But then what you need to do is you need to somehow transform this result in a language that we use, and you need to explain what does it mean, and you need to build a certain picture of the world that is consistent with this result. And this is again overstepping the boundaries of science, of natural sciences, of some isolated science. This is again the field of inquiry of philosophy. So I think that the natural sciences are very important, we can say, in that intermediate stage of exploring reality, where you actually obtain some sort of empirical insights and empirical elements out of which you can see if a certain set of assumptions and certain picture of the world is self-consistent or not. But the fundamental phase, and that one that comes at the end of the research, you cannot do at the science itself. Both of them are actually leading again, I think, to philosophy. So I think in that sense, that is one of the main problems of physics or science, natural sciences in general now, that they have become isolated from philosophy. So in the academical sense of research, it is not considered to be related to philosophy. Most of the researchers don't even have a very basic notions about philosophy or its history or main schools of philosophy. And then it becomes more and more difficult actually to come out of the current assumptions and pictures of the reality that we have. And that is also one of the reasons why in the last 50 years the fundamental science is actually slowed down significantly in its development. So ever since quantum theory and general relativity, and it will be almost 100 years now from the birth of both, we didn't have any new fundamental theories, any new theories that would be so radically changing our view of reality, or everything that happened after is actually just a series of insights and discoveries which are still within the framework of those two theories. And we know that actually those two theories are not complete because they don't take into account each other. So quantum physics can now not explain gravity, and general relativity assumes classical determinism and classical field theory. So it doesn't take into account quantum physics. So this shows that we are actually
they exclude each other.
Yeah, they exclude each other based on their logical foundations of both. So we are then in a crisis because we have two actually pictures of reality, scientific pictures of reality, and they are not reconciled on the fundamental level, and we don't know, we do not know still how to do that. And I think many great physicists who have all the mathematical skills and or the heavy artillery of advanced mathematics and numerical methods and whatever, they have all dealt with that problem. So I don't think that the problem is the technical skill needed within the framework that we have, but that we need to actually change some of our fundamental concepts we have now. And in order to do that, you need to go back to foundations and to philosophical criticism of our theories.
But okay, but what is in particular about Kashmiri Shaivism that got your interest?
Actually, it is mostly, if I would need to choose a particular point, I would say it's mostly its practical side. So its approach and methods to meditation, and it's the type of devotion that is actually developed within this tradition. But from the theoretical side, I think it is especially this very profound notions of ultimate reality, which actually is inseparable from its own self-reflective movement, the Vimarsha, the Spanda, which is a very unique way of explaining reality, which you cannot find in any other school of philosophy. And it all is constructed in such a unique way that it makes one spiritual, philosophical, and practical core, the unity. So in that sense, it's a very, very remarkable system.
So what is your understanding of Vimarsha?
What is I think
what is your understanding?
My understanding of it. It's actually, I think, such concepts are very difficult to be expressed in words, in pictures, because it is something dealing with the fundamental aspects of reality, and it cannot have much concreteness in itself, because if we would be concrete, then we are still far away from the absolute character that we want to describe. So it needs to be very abstract in its sense, the understanding of this. So, but very basically speaking, I'm just understanding that the absolute, the totality, which actually compasses everything which exists and which creates the manifold world that we observe of objects and perceivers of those objects, in order to manifest itself, this absolute, it needs to actually undergo a certain change, a certain transformation in order to actually manifest its own potential, its own existence. But it cannot manifest into something else, because it is everything which is existing. So it can just change into its own self, but this change into own self is actually self-identity. It's not that you are changing and losing your own nature. You are changing, but your own nature actually remains the same. That means that you are actually changing, in a sense, going out of yourself, but while going out, you are just getting back to yourself. And that is,
you never lose contact with yourself.
You never lose contact with yourself. And that is actually what I understand to be the concept of the reflection as a self-reflection. Because you self-reflect with this manifestation of your own nature, which actually brings diversity, but this diversity stays always contained in the unity.
Yeah, because Vimarsha always goes together with Prakasha.
Yes, right? Yeah, they are inseparable.
Yeah, but Prakasha is that manifestation,
yes.
And Vimarsha is the knowledge of that manifestation. Yes. Well, coming back to reality again. So scientists, of course there are so many different opinions. Scientists would say the reality is material world, physical world. Religious people would say it is the God, the creator. Some other people say it's consciousness. So how does physics deal with that problem?
Actually, the answer is very simple, that it does not. In that sense, it is related to what we said before, that actually this type of inquiry is something related to research in philosophy. So mostly, and which is quite unsatisfactory, the science does not actually deal with that kind of questions. It doesn't have the proper method, nor most of the scientists are in their professional time interested for these kind of questions. So most of them have some personal beliefs, some personal worldview, which they sometimes, even in a very unnatural way, dissociate from their research. It's like, I believe personally in this, and my research is just concerned with some technicalities, and those two things, they don't need to have anything in common. Of course, this is completely unsatisfactory, because if we are investigating the nature, if we are investigating the reality, we need to actually unify our approaches and unify different paths toward that reality, that of empirical sciences and that of philosophy and that of our own personal beliefs. I think it's very unsatisfactory if I say I have my own spiritual beliefs like that, or I don't have any kind of spiritual beliefs, and this is not in any way connected to what is my view of on the reality, and this is not in any way connected how I do science. No, I think it is all very inconsistent in essence. So, but I would say then when we need to.
What is your personal?
So my personal opinion is actually each of those options that were named. It captures some of the aspects of reality, some of the aspects. But the problem is that each of them is actually not complete. Each of them leaves a very important aspect of reality out of its own view. So each of them is then not, in my opinion, satisfactory for describing the reality. So if you say the material world, then most people will imagine this material world just to be a collection of separate entities. Mm-hmm. So you have separate entities of different kinds, like you and me and those cups, and then maybe you have some processes and transformations operating among those essences. Then the question emerges, how come, if those entities of material nature, if we view them just as completely separate from each other, how can they influence each other? How can they turn into each other? How come that there is possible creation and destruction of things? There needs to be something which is actually bringing all these concrete things into unity, and which cannot then on its own be a separate concrete thing. No? So in that aspect, this understanding is problematical. Then again, if we go to another way, and then we say that the ultimate cause of the reality is the God as a creator, then again we are separating the creator from what has been created. We think that somehow the creator creates the universe and it is no longer present in the universe. Somehow it is a different type of the reality. How can he then be an infinite being if he is not? If we can draw a type of a separation between him and reality. And then again, if he is producing this in some way as an architect or a sculptor is producing his work, then this looks all too much like our own personification of we are projecting our own limited action, limited consciousness on something that is far greater than that. That's a problem with that definition. Then, in a third way, if we understand consciousness, then as the ultimate source of reality, then most of the people actually take a definition of consciousness in which a consciousness is a separated individual consciousness, or some type of a generalization of that consciousness, some type of super consciousness, but which is still an isolated consciousness which has its own concrete separated ideas, intentions, desires, and so on. And then again, we didn't come to the understanding of the unity of reality, its central aspect. But my view is that actually if you take any of those starting points, any of those notions, the material world, the God, the consciousness, and then you really develop them, you really try to expand the description of reality within this starting framework, and then you really make them as general, as unifying as possible, then I think at one point there will be a convergence of all different methods. Because if you, for instance, take material world, and then you really want to make an understanding of reality as a material, as a type of complete monism. That means you cannot say there are forces which act on matter, because the force would be something else, not included in the matter. If you want to have only matter, then you need to put the power to self-organize, the power to change. You need to give it the attribute of being infinite. And then you actually need to leave this view of reality as consisting just of separate objects and nothing else. In the same way, if you actually if you negate this separation of the creator and what is created, and if you take away the personifications that people put in the absolute being, then you come to the view that you cannot completely separate the material world from what you call God itself, that it is the one and the same reality. And again, if you try to work within the framework of the notion of consciousness, then you need to actually make this consciousness a universal consciousness, a consciousness which manifests into the material world itself. And then again, you come to something very, very similar as in the two previous the paths that you took. So I think most of the problem is not so much that we need to choose a starting point and then we need to fight which starting point is correct. But I think the problem is mostly we don't go too deep in each of those starting points from which we start our investigation. We go just to a very shallow level. We just say, my belief is this, I understand things to be like that, but we never go into the very real questions. Okay, if you say the reality is material, what is matter? If you say that what is God? What is the relationship of the God in this universe that we experience?
So if you take that ultimate reality is material world, then if you start investigating, if you start searching, researching, you will not necessarily ask the question, what caused of this material world? What are the elements that bring it?
Yeah, you were actually at one point, I believe, what the attributes which you associate with consciousness, self-reflection, some possibility to create new forms, to create structures from within itself. You will need to actually find that properties in the material world itself. You will need to find that aspects of what we call consciousness actually already exist in the material world, that there is no strict separation from both. And then in that sense, you will get to a unified picture. Because I think, many people say,
but this is that relationship between the knowing subject and the object and the knowledge that connects them, right?
Yes, essentially, yeah. Yes. And we just need to go, I think, somehow we need to try with our limited abilities to go as deep as possible. We should never take things for granted, stop asking questions and thinking about the meaning of the very notions that we are. And when we start doing that, they will not be static anymore, they will become fluid. And when they become fluid, they will be actually transforming each other and going towards the unity. Because many people would say, like, I guess many people in science, they would say or give their own definition as that they are materialists, in a sense, that they believe in a material world, in the objects and so on. The problem is that they are mostly not consistent with themselves, because they say that there are forces acting, or that this material world exhibits some kind of laws, and then they understand that these forces or fields, or on the other hand laws, are something different from the matter. And then you don't just believe in one type of reality, you believe in the second type, which is these mathematical laws or whatever, and you don't answer what is their nature. You don't explain how can you actually derive them from this material world, and you don't try to do this, you just say there are two kind of things, but initially you say I'm just a materialist. So it's not a problem of the starting position. I think you can take the material world, and I think it's a very good starting point because you don't assume that much. But then you really need to go into investigation of it fully, not just sticking the banner, I'm a materialist. Then go and investigate the matter, but then you start thinking, how come that this matter self-organizes? How come that it moves? How come that it brings the relationship of all these various parts? How come that out of itself it needs to create what we call natural laws? And then it's not just some inert passive matter anymore, some collection of objects. So I think we all need to be ready to somehow, not to prescribe to a certain worldview, to a certain picture, and then just stay there. But I think we need to open the spirit of investigation, to consider ourselves as investigators, because what we know is so limited. No? And it cannot be compared to that what we do not know.
Is trying to avoid subjectivity, and that is probably why they.
There are two actually, I think, ways in which we can understand what it means to be subjective, and maybe that is also causing this way of this attitude, no? Because subjectivity sometimes implies relativism. That you have different perspectives, and then you take a particular one, and this is what is subjective. So as science wants to be a universal description of reality, then you want to overcome this sort of relativism. But the other, real and higher meaning of the subjectivity, which implies the actually creative activity of the subject in creating the very notions and its own perception of reality, that is a very delicate notion. It is very complicated notion which also requires some speculative thinking. So I think for that notion you need to go to philosophy and
then again you might the same problem, because there is an observer here, because there is a relationship with it, because the scientist who is the observer, he is observing that object that he is investigating, and on that he projects his own subjectivity.
Yeah. In the sense, one wants to make too much out of his own.
This is what gives life to that object. The consciousness of that observer.
Yeah, that is something that is even in the European philosophy there for a very long time, even since Immanuel Kant. The very idea that subject is not just somebody who is passively receiving the impression of the object and just reflecting it as it is. So subject is the one actually who is constructing reality, who makes this picture of reality. This is an investigation of the faculties of knowing, which started Immanuel Kant, and then they led to development of German idealism. And then, for sure, already from that sort of inquiry, we need to conclude and take into account that our experience of reality is actually a product of our own relationship, the relationship of our consciousness with respect to the reality, something that we construct within the process. And this has all been confirmed, not just in physics, but in neuroscience, in psychology, in all the fields of research. We just came to the conclusion that we need to abandon that very simple and naive picture, that we can just grasp the reality as it is. It is just given somewhere outside, and then it is just making like a mirror picture in our consciousness, and that's all. We just need to wipe out the impurities from that mirror, and then we'll know the reality. So we are actually, our own then intellectual history is in that way a construction of a given picture.
So what is then the role of the observer, knowing subject, in creating reality, if any?
I think it's a very actually complicated question, that somehow we try to understand better and better by different methods and in different fields of inquiry. So we could say, if we stay on that psychological level at first, that we talked about a bit, then I think we already stated that the very experience of reality that some limited subject is actually having is his own activity. So the role of the observer itself is actually to construct that reality which he is observing. This is not some passive reflection of external reality, but it is the active result of his organs and of his consciousness, which is combining all these organs and their activities in one unified whole, which is a perception of reality. So, but that means something very actually beautiful, I think, that we can grasp better the reality itself if we focus on the observer. And the observer is something which is the closest to us. There is nothing closer to us because we are the observers, you know, naturally we are. So the first thing that we experience is some kind of modification of consciousness and some kind of perception which happens within the consciousness. So that means that if we somehow try to investigate that consciousness, if we try to perceive better ourselves as an observers, that means if we try to reflect practically on our own nature as observers.
If we know ourselves first.
Yes, we can actually go a lot ahead in understanding the reality, the so-called external reality, because now we said that the very experience of it is actually based on the observer as it is. But on the other hand, I wouldn't go that far to imply that a limited observer, some being as we are, can somehow directly construct the reality from his own limited consciousness. So as we are bounded to the body and to the material reality, we are bounded also to the causal relationships. And that also means that actually we need to discriminate between this limited observer and this faculty of being a subject that we can ascribe to the reality itself, the somehow the complete reality, because as we said before, even if we take like material objects as a starting point, we need to, by investigating that position, come to the conclusion that it is not just some random chaotic movement, but that it involves a self-organization and change and a way of self-reflection. You know, even if you shout at the hill, it creates an echo. So even in this very mechanical type of systems, you have a certain type of response from a system in which a system acts as a self-regulated and having its own type of identity. You know, so I want to say, the very material world, the matter itself, then exhibits the properties of a subject. But this whole reality, which we then understand as also being a subject, to some extent we need to investigate to which actually extent.
Does the objectivity exist independent of observer?
Well,
so I know it's a big question.
That's a very, very, very strongly philosophical question. No? But we cannot. I mean, that would just require a lot of discussion. So maybe I can just sum up some of my ideas on that. Sure. So I would briefly answer. My brief answer would be that it exists because of the fact of the existence of other observers. The very idea of a limited observer implies that there are always some other observers who are also participating in the very same reality. And in that sense, one observer is just like a branch on the tree. And the ultimate reality is the tree itself, which is of course connected to that branch. The reality itself cannot exist without material parts of it, without its own manifestation. And each part cannot exist without the relationship to all other parts. So in that sense, but we cannot from that, I think it is not logically justified to conclude that they are completely equally footed. No, I think we also need to somehow respect how low we are as a limited observers in the whole structure of the nature and the universe.
Okay, that implies that there are higher observers than us.
Yes, yes. I think that is also now very speculative from the point of view of science. But I think that what we can say, that it has been a common experience of our investigation of nature, is that there is always a development in organization of various forms. You know? And then it would be so pretentious and egocentric to think that in the universe there is no higher type of an observer than us. That we are and we see that our type of perception is actually very limited, and that it is very, very often acting in the sense of preventing us from seeing and experiencing reality. We are caught in all these affections, illusions, wrong types of perceptions. That means for sure that the evolution of nature in various parts of the universe, if we assume it according to our current knowledge to be also spatially infinite, sooner or later needs to actually establish different types of observers. But I think we can also know that from our own practical experience, so at least a bit. So from our own practical experience, we can see that there are different levels of self-consciousness that we observe. And so we know the states when we are completely under the influence of the affections, or some other states where we are completely actually under the influence of passions and instincts. Then we know some other states where we are more calm and acting rationally. And then we can actually see that those...
these are the degrees, so
for instance, I mean, the degrees of self-awareness and of types of perception, for instance, just to give some illustration. So these are all scales of experience that we observe regularly. And we can actually notice that what we observe as a part of this spectrum of our experience is actually for some other species their own proper space to which they are limited, like animals and plants. You know, we can have this type of experience in some moments as humans, you know? But we can go higher than that. And we are humans not because we drink, eat and have sex. We are humans because we can think and we can be self-aware. This is this higher aspect. So then again, if we practice meditation, I think, regardless of how deep we go into it, but we realize that in the meditation we can reach some different states of perception than in everyday and regular life, and we can also experience it in the meditation itself. As we are developing, we can experience different types of perceptions. Then we can also, from this,
so this is the argument for the existence of
I think, because then we can also, based on all this logic and all this experience, say that there must be some other types of consciousness which are residing on these higher states that we can maybe reach in meditation for a very small break of a second. The same way as we are for them, as animals are for us who are residing in the sphere of instinct, for instance. So I think that it's a very logically strong argument.
Yes. So just coming back to this, the reality again. So some of Indian philosophies like Nyaya and Vaisheshika, they try to bring some kind of you can say order in this great variety that exists. So they try to see what are the basic elements, basic categories under which all this great variety can be summed up. And so some schools say there are like 16 categories, some say 7, various categories. So is there any attempt in this way to kind of deal with the we can say chaos, great variety of the universe in physics?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point actually. I think this is not just specific for Indian philosophy, although it's a nice example of the tattvas as understood in various systems, but
These are not tattvas.
You're not thinking about, I was thinking, you were thinking about, but okay, in more general sense of the elements, okay?
They don't talk
okay.
about tattvas, they talk about categories like time, space, Atman,
okay.
Yeah. So they try to bring, to see how that you can bring all this variety, you can sum up under all these certain number of categories. No tattvas.
Okay. But okay. I mean, if we want to somehow sum up all of this, then we can in any case say that we are taking the variety of existence of different forms and understanding it to rest on some smaller number of notions.
Exactly.
That's the essence. So if we define it like that, we can take also this. Categories of a substance, so to say, and that was together because it is
Dravyas and all of this. Yeah.
So I think in any philosophy or in any science or in any attempt to understand reality, we try to come from the manifold to that which is unified. So there is a manifold, actually, the manifold aspect of reality. So various tendencies, various objects, various properties. And human consciousness is never actually satisfied with that kind of a description. We don't feel like that we have established some kind of a system of a science until we move forward in unifying all these various descriptions, and it seems that it always happens by introducing some sort of categories, whether they are more logical categories connected as to the substance as the attribute of the substance, or they are more having the so to say, they are more connected to the taste of unifying experience in different types of elements, like the types of elements of fire, water, earth. It is always the fact that we are somehow arranging our experience of reality in some logical elements, or what we understand to be logical elements. And this is what is also done in physics, because we talk about 4 fundamental interactions, and this is again the representation of the same tendency to bring a manifold experience of reality under some limited set of various basic notions. So I think it's confirmed in every discipline actually that we somehow want to come to these basic elements of reality. But then what I think is important at a certain step, after the elements have been established in some way, to overcome the notion of the elements and their division, to actually understand that we have now separated reality on different instances, but then we need to find everything in everything, how those different elements are all contained within each other, and what is their relationship, and how they come about from something which is higher even than themselves. So I think as they are so important, they are sort of a ladder, that you take a ladder, you climb up, and then you don't need a ladder anymore at some point.
Does this have anything to do with universals?
Yeah, it is, I think we can, this discussion covers also the universals. It is
so there are universals, like in Indian philosophy, usually example would be the cowness.
Yes.
So what unifies all the cows that are different, in color and shape and size, is that cowness in them. So then there is a cowness, there is a humanness, there is an animalness.
Yes.
But
yes.
is there then the supreme universal, unifying all of these universals?
That is actually what is somehow the goal for the sciences in our experience. And we cannot now, in all honesty, answer that question definitely, because we need to come to it in order to answer positively. But even the very experience of our evolution of knowledge shows that what was previously unrelated becomes related. What was previously separated in our understanding of reality becomes one unified entity. So we have seen the progress actually of our understanding of reality as a progress of unification. So we can from this, at least to some extent, have a confidence that there needs to be
so you're saying everything is going in the direction of absolute
I think it is
monism.
Yeah, I think that the whole experience of our reality, especially the one that has been brought up from natural sciences, converges to the picture of absolute monism.
Time is something that really interests me personally a lot, and I try to think about it and study and read. And normally, for us ordinary people, we experience time as something, as a flow. Time is moving. It is an activity. It's an action. And usually we divide it into three. The present, past, and future. Usually the present is something which is, everybody thinks, in terms that actually time try to catch the present, and the past is something that has already gone, and future is something that hasn't yet come. So this is the ordinary, understanding. Now, do physicists also think in these terms, or do they have another way of time?
So this is a bit again connected to the question with which we started this conversation, that actually physics does not explicitly think about time much, because it somehow assumes it and then just uses it as a degree of freedom in describing reality. So, but still we can then draw some conclusions from the position of this concept of time as it exists in various physical theories and how they develop. So what is actually, I think, the deepest insight in the framework of physics regarding the question of time is that its nature is relative, dependent on the context, dependent on the situation of which the given observer is actually situated in, and that it is not separated from what is called space. So in general theory of relativity especially, but already in special theory of relativity, time and space lose their independent status. It is not that we have two types of entity, one is called time and the other is called space, and then we have a conservation of spatial distances and conservation of time distances and the absolute nature of time. It is that we have a unified single type of description, which is called space-time, which is a four-dimensional space-time, and neither space nor time is actually absolute in that structure of space-time. So space is relative, time is relative, the intervals of space, the distances can change depending on the movement of the observer, and then the time sequence also changes depending on the movement on the observer. What is absolute in this theory of special relativity is the space-time interval, the way in which space and time are combined together to give a sort of a unit of length in the four-dimensional continuum of space-time. So it's not, as it is often held, everything is relative. No, special relativity is not about that things are all relative, but it is actually there is one thing which is absolute, in it as in a theory, and that is this invariant interval of space-time, and this is actually connected to the assumption that the propagation of light or of electromagnetic waves is constant, that the speed of light is constant regarding of the observer and its type of motion. And then general relativity even goes much further than that, and it says that actually this structure, the unified structure of space and time, is not just unified, but it is even not static, it is dynamical. So the way how components of space and time are all entangled together, it changes. It is a dynamical description, and this depends on the matter and energy which is situated in space-time. So the matter and energy changes the configuration, the shape, so to say, of the space-time, and when we move in such space-time that has been reshaped by the presence of matter energy, then the experience that we have that comes out of that curvature of space-time, being away from the flat configuration, we call it gravity. So that is a remarkable thing, that three completely separate types of phenomena: time, space, and what we call force, the gravitational force, were now just united in a single entity of space-time, then which is in its essence dynamical. So, but still we do not know how to unite space-time with matter and energy, because we have united those three, but we still have matter energy as something which is curving space-time, and somehow we imagining to be something different than space-time itself. So we don't know, and we don't understand what is its actual relationship. Can we somehow unite space, time, matter, energy in one single concept, in one single entity? Maybe that is the resolution of the problem. But that is what we don't know.
But time is really, it's very abstract. You cannot really point at something and say, this is time. We know time only through something else. We can point through the movement of the stars, planets, changing of the seasons, like that. And so many people, I think, at least some people, this kind of aspect of time makes people think that time is actually not real.
So I would say that time is, in one aspect, certainly real, and that it is an element of our experience. It is similar. I can just give my opinion on this topic, because I think some general discussion would lead us too far. No? I think it's similar with, for instance, smell or taste. Is taste or smell, are they real? They are real as an experience that we observe, that they have this reality. They are actually part of our consciousness. They are part of our experience of the world. But we now know that there is no such thing as smell or taste existing objectively as a separate entity there in nature. It comes as a type of a reaction between, it's a long chain of different chemical processes and stimulations and everything like that. And it has its own mechanisms on which it operates. So our organs need to be in contact with the object, and somehow the sensation is created. So I think it is similar with time, in the sense that it exists as an aspect of our experience. Somehow it manifests something in the reality, but then again, I think as a notion, if we make an investigation of it, then I think we need to come with a conclusion that it is not a priori existing independently in the reality itself somehow. So it is something that I think we constructed as a notion and a means of explaining reality through our own psychological and social evolution and development. So the experience of it is real, but that does not mean that ontologically it is a category which is actually describing the reality itself. Somehow, this is also somehow connected to some speculation in speculations in the modern physics. Mm-hmm. So, because if you want to somehow bridge this distinction between this general theory of relativity, the space-time, and the quantum physics, and you have this space-time as a single entity, then you somehow need to explain how the space and time actually emerge at all as a phenomena. And then there is at least a very popular opinion regarding that the time is both space, in some sense, an emergent phenomenon, that there is a deeper underlying structure of physics, and then what comes as a time that we actually somehow experience has its own relative existence, but it emerges from a deeper set of conditions where there is no such thing, there is no such time. So I think what is actually, what we can infer already from our own psychological experience of the reality is that we cannot speak about time if there is no some type of a change, some type of a change of a movement, of transformation. And if we go into some physical definitions of how we think or define time, we always see that there is some change implied. Yes. So even in the very definition of a day or of a year, there is just a comparison between different types of changes. As we take a coin, and then we say this coin will be €1 or $1, and we make it as a unit of measuring currency. So mostly, from the practical point of view, we take one type of a change. Is it the rotation of the Earth around its axis, the revolution of the Earth around the Sun, or the modern definition of a second based on the transitions in energy level in cesium, isotope. Yeah. It is all irrelevant, but you always somehow compare changes to each other. And when there is no change, when there is no movement...
If you watch these physicists talking about time, they usually talk about measuring, how time is measured. Yeah. Mostly go deep into discussion on that and how can it be. But time is basically just a measure of regular change.
Yeah.
But another thing about time is that it is very subjective. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you, as Einstein gave that beautiful example, I think that's at least what I heard, that he said that if you're sitting on the hot stove, the time is passing very quickly, or very slowly. And if you are with your girlfriend, then it is passing very. Is this?
But I think Einstein himself did not. I think because he's attributed to every sort of saying that it become popular.
But that's what I heard. But in any case, it's a good example.
I think
that subjective thing. I'll say. Let me just. So it's very subjective, So if you are in love, time is not. There is no time. Mm-hmm. You just don't have that feeling of time. Mm. If you are anybody who meditates or who meditated deeply knows that if you go deep into meditation, when you come out, you don't know is it 2 minutes or 2 hours past.
Yeah.
So there is really that aspect of time is also very interesting.
I think in order to discuss a notion like time or any other notion which is actually both a part of our experience and a part of the vocabulary of science, we somehow need to observe its evolution. And then actually the very notion of time also changes and it has different ways of understanding it regarding if we are talking about our usual experience as a human, our usual psychological experience, and time as a physical quantity. So somehow physics as a science starts with that basic concept of time that we have, that is already established in the language. It is not that physics just introduced time out of nothing, but that physical concept of time is then based on somehow, how to say, quantization and strict definition of this concept with respect to some other quantities. So I'm saying that there is a special notion of time, which we could call the physical notion of time, which is not completely identical with this psychological time. It is a specific type of defining time.
So
and when we're defining
two types of time, psychological time and
yes, this time which is somehow part of our experience of reality, and then there is this time which is an element of description of reality as used by physics, which tries to somehow get away with all the subjectivity contained in that notion initially, and then to make it universal for all the observers, regardless of their position. But then, what has been demonstrated by development of physics, by special theory of relativity, that you can never actually establish such a universal notion of time, because even in physics, that physical time will then become contextual dependent on the state of motion of the observer, or in general theory of relativity, dependent where the observer is situated in this space-time and what is the geometry of this space-time around some point. So actually physics tries to define some kind of an objective universal time, and to try to establish it gets rid of this psychologically subjectively contained elements of this description of time. But then even this purified, so to say, notion of time used in physics came to the conclusion that it needed to actually take into account the very fact that even this physical time needs to be relative, that there is no such thing as objective time. And if we essentially understand time to be the manifestation of change, and the change to be fundamental notion in reality, and time just as its consequence, then this is actually very logical, because of course the change, the rate of the change is always dependent on the context in which the change happens. But the physics, the classical physics, and now we know that that was wrong, took a different stance, that there is one objective parameter, like the flow of a river, which is then encapsulating all the reality in itself, and it is called time. It is there, it is just flowing independently of what we are doing, it just flows constantly. So we proved that that is wrong. We proved even that mathematically defined time is dependent on the situation.
Is there absolute time?
No, that's what I'm saying. There is no absolute time. There cannot be absolute time. So time is necessary subjective, even in physics, even that type of physical time, mathematically defined time. But I'm saying, those are two levels, different levels of experience. So if we have those two observers, and one is sitting on a hot stove, and another one is reading a very boring book, they will all have, if they have some...
if you measure time at the same time will pass. That is kind of
but subjective.
And subjective is
psychological time is actually related to how their actually consciousness is perceiving a rate of change. And that is of course dependent of what type of processes does consciousness at that instant find more important or less important, or and then because consciousness, we see it all the time, actively reorganizes itself in accordance with the surrounding. So it is something, a creative portrayer of the surroundings and its own self. So of course then this psychological notion of time will not necessarily be different.
In Indian philosophy, in particular in Kashmir Shaivism philosophy, the time and space, the definition, the space is defined as placing objects in the empty space, which then implies their relationship, causality, and all the other things. And the time is the movement of these objects. in space. Does this make any sense from the perspective of physics?
I think it makes a lot of sense, especially from that perspective that we argued in favor of, that the time and space are both the descriptions which actually emerge, that they are not characterizing the reality on its own as a fundamental description of reality, but that they emerge. So we need to somehow explain how both time and space show up in our perception. How do they develop?
There are aspects of subjectivity, as you just pointed out. Yeah?
So I think really, this could be a long discussion, no? But thinking about those issues, I came to the conclusion that essentially the best way in terms of the explanation and the psychological and scientific description of our experience with time and space is to understand them as the manifestation of change and difference. So if you have one unified reality with no separation in itself, then it is just completely equal from itself. If that unified reality makes a separation, that means it makes part of itself distant.
If it brings multiplicity.
Yes, multiplicity. If the multiplicity actually emerges from the unity, then this multiplicity will just be some objects, and there will be some relationship between these objects, and this is the space. And then if you have a change in the transformation of the absolute one single unity, that means that a thing will now be in one state, and then it will be in a different state. So you have a transformation of all those objects which emerged, and then from this you see that actually transformation of unity into multiplicity logically emerges as two separate aspects. One of divisions, multiplicity as a divisions of one single, and emerging of change. So one is the spatial distance. Because you somehow define the space from the relationship between the objects, you can say like that. And then the time you define through change. But if you are just, for instance, assuming that you are resting in that unity, then there is no separateness. There is no separate elements. There is no multiplicity. There is no change to something else. There is no space. There is no time.
Yes, indeed. You see, the fact, what I just mentioned earlier, the fact that subjectively the duration of time can last different. So that actually, in the nirvikalpa state, the nirvikalpa indeterminate state, that is in indeterminate state. There is that duration can be of any length.
I think there is no if we are negating the very space and time, then we cannot speak in terms of space and time. So, like infinity, it is not a number. But so also the moment. Really, I think if taken properly, then it is not a unit of time. It is something that transcends time. It is not bounded by the category of time. So I think in nirvikalpa state there is no time and space. So we cannot even speak about the duration.
Yeah, in nirvikalpa has many different layers.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, for sure.
So the time and space still exist in.
Of course, because it's also a process which takes separate levels. No?
But in that ultimate.
But if we are speaking about the ultimate.
There is no. Yes. But in nirvikalpa, that state that is actually quite an important point, because there 1 second can last an eon, and 2 hours can.
There is no boundedness to the very concept.
Exactly. And so also in Indian philosophy there is an attempt to overcome the time, and it is usually associated with time is generally understood as the movement activity, and activity of what? activity or movement of thoughts. And so, as long as there is the thoughts are moving,
Yeah.
and this is, of course, we all have that experience. We cannot control the thought. Thought come from somewhere, they come and go, emerge and disappear, and another thought comes in its place. That is that perception, that flow of perception. So, in Indian philosophy, especially in Shaivism, this is actually emphasized, but also in other texts also. But that one has to stop. And this is actually also related to the breath.
Because
So you have to stop the breathing. When the breathing ceases, then
the thoughts also.
the thought cease. And then the thought cease, then there is no time. The time stops also. That I'm sure there is nothing of, nobody, no physicist has ever talked about that.
No, of course, yes.
Then, yeah. You have also read, I know, read at least some of the chapter 6, and so there some of the practices are described. Practices to accomplish that state, to become free from time. Any opinion on that?
Yeah, so I again think we need to turn to our experience that we are certain of. No? And then this experience always teaches us that our perception of time changes according to the circumstances. And we have the special events when we are very frightened, when the dog, for instance, jumps out of us, or we see some wild animal, or we are chased by enemies, or we think that maybe we will die, no? And then we can experience that the concept of time, it is very loosened. No? The things are now very, 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 very slow. All our perception of time changes radically in that situations, and the thinking stops, not completely, and we are not completely rid of time, but we can really see how this time, which was a very solid concept and notion, which was ruling over us, in that situation it becomes very, very like mortening and slowly disappearing. So we see that our experience of time, especially in such radical situations, can be changed dramatically, and that we can lose, so to say, this bondage of time in perception over us. Then I think the real question is, if this happens without our own effort, it just happens due to some external events which shock us and bring us to such state. That means that all the requirements for achieving such state are already in us. We just need to somehow practice and enable to have the control of those processes that were activated in such shocking moments, so that we can voluntarily actually achieve the same thing in us. So I really think what is going on basically in the exercises, like in the chapter 6, is that by practicing, then one can in principle become a master of these processes, and this type of states that happen without our will, at shocking moments, they become within our reach and within the field of our conscious effort, and perhaps even more than that. So I think it's very reasonable to think that one can become a ruler of time, or to get rid of the bondage of time to a very higher degree than we are now in our everyday life. Of course, I mean, the only way to really know the answer is to try to practice as much as we can, and to devote ourselves to the practice. That is the practical question, not to be just theoretized. But I think also, but is the fact, as long as we are residing in the body, our body will be related to these external causal effects. And although we can get rid of this, our psychological way of how we perceive the time, we will our body will still be under the sway of this physical time. No? But that is not so troubling, I think, because what we experience is actually only our perception. You know? And if we are in our perception somehow, at least to some extent, established in ourselves and having control over how we perceive time and not being associated with the body, at least to some extent, then whatever happens in this physical sense will not shake us from there. So I think you know, many people who are interested in Indian philosophy spend too much time thinking about this highest speculative questions. Can I really like overcome the time physically? Can I be at different places at the same time, and so on? And I think we should not devote ourselves to such.
What physics would say, is time travel possible?
Yeah,
that sounds something like.
But I think we should not be focused on such, you know, very hypothetical questions, very far away from what we can actually do. But I think we should go and practice. And practice and see.
But as you pointed out, this is really not that very far. You know, as you, for example, usually, you know, if you walk somewhere in India, you know, and the snake jumps, you immediately, the reaction is instantaneous. The intelligence is there. You don't, you know, but that also points out in another important aspect, that Nirvikalpa is not just Nirvikalpa, that there is always Vikalpa there too. Because at that moment when you saw the snake, your reaction was instantaneous. And that is not because of Nirvikalpa.
You know?
And this is a very important. So intelligence is already there. So we are, I mean, in every act of perception.
Yeah, it is not just that it is a void.
The experience of beauty.
Yeah.
No? Even in English, there is that beautiful expression. When you see something beautiful, what's the expression?
You lost your breath.
This takes my breath away, you know, because the breath really stops.
Yeah, and then the thinking stops.
For that moment, when the breath stops, the thinking stops. All of this. So yeah. Anyway, so I want to thank you very much for.
Well, thank you. It was, I think, a very interesting discussion. No? So some very nice questions that we discussed. No, I enjoyed it.
Hopefully, make him do it again at some point.
Yes.